Welcome to this video. Today we'll be looking at the Albin Counter-Gambit, and it goes like this. Pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, pawn to e5. So what's going on here? White plays the Queen's Gambit, black responds with e5 going for the Albin Counter-Gambit. This is a pawn which we should take, pawn takes e5, and now if black takes our pawn, we can take his queen on d8 with a check, king takes, knight c3, and the king is actually quite vulnerable here on d8, and this pawn on c4 is even weaker than our pawn on e5. Play could follow something like knight c6, knight f3, protecting the pawn on e5, bishop b4, pinning our knight, and we can continue with bishop to d2, and the next move we will castle long, and white is much better here. So this is not really the idea of playing the gambit. The main idea is actually to push the pawn forward. And here is actually quite a famous trick. If white now plays a move like e3, this is not a good move. This is a mistake. Black can give a check here on b4. If white blocks now with the bishop, like this, black can take on e3, and at first it looks like, wait, there is a free bishop now on b4, but black has a trick. He can now take on f2, hitting the king, hitting the knight, and if white recaptures, the queen is falling. And if white plays king e2, black has a really cool trick here. He can take the knight on g1 and make a knight, giving a check to the white king. So white is not in time now to take the queen on d8. So let's say he recaptures here on g1. Black can play bishop to g4 check, hitting the king, hitting the queen, and black is winning. So this is what you should avoid when you play against the Albin Counter-Gambit. Instead, you should play knight to f3. You're protecting the pawn on e5, hitting the pawn on d4, and black has to protect this pawn somehow now. Now it would be a mistake for black to play a move like bishop c5, protecting the pawn, because white will play knight d2. The next move, the knight is going to b3, and white is doing excellent here. Also, black can try to give a check here on b4, but this just delays the problems for him. White will play knight bd2. The next move, perhaps he can play a3, and white is much better. Also, some players have tried to protect the d4 pawn with the c pawn, playing pawn to c5, but black is not doing great in this line. We will play pawn to e3. Black will continue protecting the pawn on d4 with knight c6, protecting the pawn. We will take the pawn now on d4, and after a move like c takes d4, we'll put the bishop on d3. The next move we will castle, and actually we also have pawn up, so it's all happy days. Black can try to pin the knight, bishop to g4, pinning our queen, but we will simply castle the king. And now there is a nice trick. If black decides to take our pawn here, hoping that if we take back, our queen is hanging on d1, we have the very nice trick of playing queen to e1, pinning the black knight. And if black were to take our knight here on f3, we can now take the knight on e5, giving a check, and the next move we can pick up also the bishop, resulting in being a piece up. So this position is quite bad for black. The computer almost gives like +2 advantage here for white, so this is not great. For this reason, all the black players, they choose to play the move knight to c6, protecting the pawn on d4, hitting the pawn on e5, and black is going to play for development. So after this move, now will come my main recommendation of the video, to play knight bd2. And this is in contrast to a lot of books that prefer to play pawn to a3, controlling this b4 square. But knight b2 is kind of nice because you delay this move a3. You don't necessarily need to waste the move like this. A lot of times we will also later go to b3 with the knight, intending to hit the pawn on d4. But let's look at a couple of lines now. Some black players have tried to play a5, and this is like a prophylactic move, because now if the knight goes to b3, at some point black can play a move like a4. Like at some point he can give a check, and at some point there will be a4 and the knight will be in trouble. So after a5, I will recommend to play a3. And now we have a better version than the normal lines, because we have included a3 and a5, which is to our advantage, and white is doing better here. For example, the play could follow like knight e7. We can now go to b3 with the knight. And if black plays knight f5, we will play maybe a bit of a surprising move, but we'll play pawn to e3. We simply want to trade the queens. Let me illustrate. If black now takes our pawn, we will take his queen on d8. We will recapture the pawn on e3, and we are a pawn up. I know it doesn't look like maybe the best pawn in the world, but it's actually quite hard for black to get it back. And also the knight on f5 is not doing so well here. So white is clearly better. And this was just one way of playing a5 was an option. Also some players for black can try a move like bishop f5, sometimes intending to play queen d7, long castling. After this we will continue our great plan of playing knight b3, hitting the pawn on d4. And here is actually quite some interesting lines. Black can give a check now. We will parry it, bishop to d2. Black can continue with a move like queen e7. And now we will take this pawn on d4, because this was our whole plan of using 1, 2, 3 moves now to take this pawn. Black can recapture the knight. We will also take, and here actually black has a tricky move where it's a bit important to be a bit alert. If black now castles long, if we now take this bishop, there will actually be some trouble for us. For example, black can play, and black has some different ways to play here, but this pin is really annoying. And after black has moved his queen, for example, to c5, we can now not take this bishop, because he will take and our king is in a lot of trouble. So this would be a great mistake to take this bishop. Instead, we simply need to solidify our knight with the move pawn to e3, protecting the knight, and all is good here. For example, now if black plays a move like he takes our bishop, we'll recapture with the queen. And if he takes our pawn, we can play queen to c3. Next move, we'll play bishop to e2, and all is good. So this was bishop f5, where we are going to play knight b3. Another way for black to play is queen e7, trying maybe to some point to take back the pawn. But here we will simply play the move pawn to g3, developing our bishop. And now we will give back the pawn, but also black has used a lot of time to regain it. So he can take it on e5. We will take knight takes e5, queen takes e5, and we'll play knight f3, hitting the queen, hitting the pawn on d4. And okay, black can now give a check, for example, queen to a5 check. But after bishop d2, black still has the problem of the weak d4 pawn, which we will capture next. For example, after the bishop goes to b4, we can play knight takes d4, and we are again a healthy pawn up. So queen e7 is not really solving black's problem. Also, some black players have tried to sacrifice even more material, playing pawn to f6. And then we will simply take, and after he will take the knight, we can play the move pawn to g3. This is a general way of developing the bishop. It stands quite well. on this long diagonal here in g2. So now there are some different ways to play, but let's say black plays a move like bishop f5, intending again to play this plan with queen d7 and long castling. We can play bishop to g2. Let's say he continues queen d7. We can castle. Black can castle. And now we'll play pawn to a3, intending to push the pawn to b4 and in general attack black's king on the queen side. And also don't forget, we're already one pawn up. So if we ever trade the queens, we're very happy. Black can try to play actively like a move like d3. Then we will take it. And after bishop to takes d3, we can play rook to e1. And white is better here, although of course it gets a bit complicated, but again, white is a pawn up. Black can play a move like bishop to c5, but after knight to b3, I concluded that white is doing much better here. He enjoys the pawn up, and it's not so easy to see what black should do with this bishop on c5. So this was if he played f6, we will simply take, and knight takes, and g3, going for the long diagonal. Another way for black to play is developing the bishop to e6. The idea of this is also just sometimes to play queen d7, but also just to develop the pieces. Now we will play the move pawn to a3. Again, we're having ideas of pushing pawn to b4, creating space on the queen side. And if black plays the move a5 to stop us from playing pawn to b4, we can play the knight to b3, hitting the pawn on d4. And again, it's very useful for us to have the pawn on a3 compared to black's pawn on a5. So there are different ways for black to play here, but all of them are better for white. One is to play queen d7. We will continue our plan, playing the pawn to b4, and at some point putting the bishop out on b2. Perhaps also later to play g3, but black will get in trouble. This pawn on d4 will become a weakness. Also sometimes white can play the move pawn b4 to b5, eliminating the knight from c6. So after a3, some black players have tried knight to e7. We will continue our plan, playing pawn to b4. Black can play now knight to g6. And we will play bishop to b2, targeting the pawn on d4. And after a move like, there are different ways to play. If black plays knight takes e5, recapturing the pawn, we can now play a very surprising move, but a very strong one, queen to a4, pinning this knight on c6 and the king on e8. And white is doing much better here. If black takes our knight, we will recapture with the knight, and we are coming with knight takes d4. So this is again a great position for white, nothing to worry about. After bishop e6, simply a3, going for b4. Also, black can try to play bishop to g4. The idea of this is again to play queen d7 and long castling. After this, we will play pawn to g3, intending to play the bishop to g2. Black will continue with his idea of playing queen to d7, sometimes hinting at bishop to h3, and that's why I will now recommend to play pawn to h3. This makes black's life tough, because he has to do something with this bishop. If he takes the knight, that's very sad, then we will take back with the knight. Next move we will put the bishop on g2, and black is doing much better here. So this is not really satisfactory for black, so he can also try to play a move like bishop h5, but the bishop is doing quite badly here. We will play the move bishop to g2, and after a move like long castling, we will castle. Black can play maybe f6, but anyways, we're doing better here with white. We can even play a fancy move like sacrifice move like pawn to b4. If black takes this pawn, we can play queen to a4. Next move we'll play rook b1, and the black king is in trouble. So also some players have tried to move bishop to e6. We will continue our development. We will play bishop to g2. And here black has some different options. One is to play pawn to f6. Then we will simply take this pawn. And after knight takes, we will again play the idea of pawn to a3, going for b4. And in general, we are again doing better here. So after bishop g2, most black players, I would assume, would long castle, keeping the spirit of the game. After this, we will again play for our idea. We don't want to castle now, because if we castle, black will take this pawn on h3, and we are in trouble when black will storm with the pawn, h5, h5, h4. And we are doing terrible. So after long castling, I'll recommend to play pawn to a3, again going for b4 ideas, and black is in trouble. So after this, if black now plays a move like a5, this is very dangerous for black, because now we will sacrifice this pawn with the move pawn b2 to b4. If black now takes the pawn, we will recapture, and the next move, the rook is going to a8, and black's king is in severe danger. For this reason, black cannot play a5. He can play a move like knight to e7. After that, we'll play the move pawn to b4. Black will continue, most likely, knight to g6, aiming to recapture this pawn on e5. And here we have a very nice move. We'll play the move queen to a4. The idea of this is that the pawn on a7 might be hanging in many lines. One line could be knight takes e5. Then we will take on e5. Black will take on e5. And we'll take queen takes a7. And the black king is about to get mated. Black can also try to take with the other knight, but the same will happen. Queen takes a7, and the king is in grave danger. So after queen a4, black can try a move like king b8, keeping an eye on the a7 pawn. We will continue developing with a move like bishop to b2, eyeing this pawn on d4. And black can try to recapture the e5 pawn in some different ways. For example, knight takes e5. But after this move, we'll play a very nice move, very strong one, pawn to b5, hitting this knight on c6. After this, black can take our knight on f3, and we will simply recapture. The pawn on d4 will fall, and white is winning. Black can also try to take knight takes e5. Then, because the queens are in the stand, we have to do something, so we should take the queen. And if black recaptures rook takes d7, we will play pawn to c5. The next move, we will take the pawn on d4, and white is doing much better here. So this was all the bishop moves covered. We looked at bishop f5, where white plays knight b3. We looked at bishop e6, where white plays a3. And we also looked now at bishop g4, where we'll play pawn to g3, queen to d7, h3, and we will play with ideas of bishop g2 and a3 and b4. So now let's get to the line that I think most of you will face when you play the Albins. I think most players will play knight to e7, because a lot of players have been taught that this is the way to go. You want to bring the knight either to f5 or to g6 and attack the pawn on e5. After this, we will continue our plan, playing knight to b3, hitting the pawn on d4. Now, if black plays the move knight to g6, we can simply take the pawn on d4 with the knight. And this is a a lot of trouble for black. For example, if he now takes, we'll take with the queen, and we will reach an endgame being a pawn up, which is almost winning for us. So some black players have tried this. They have tried to take on e5. Now I'll recommend, there is actually a different way to play. One is to take on c6, but this is not my main recommendation. That one is to take on e5. And after this, if black plays a move like knight takes d4, we will play pawn to e3, and the knight on d4 is in trouble, and we are pawn up. Most black players have tried to play knight takes e5. After this, we will make the knight on d4 more stable with the move pawn e2 to e3. After this, black has some different ways to play, but the main one is to play bishop to c5, eyeing the d4 knight. And here I have quite a surprising recommendation. That is to play the move bishop to d2. The idea is to sacrifice back this pawn on d4. So let's say black takes this pawn, bishop takes d4, pawn takes d4, queen takes d4. We'll play bishop to c3. And this bishop is very strong. It's anchored by the pawn on b2. And even though black will perhaps try to give a check, queen e4, we will play queen to e2. If black now trades the queen, queen takes e2, we'll play bishop takes e2. The knight is in trouble on e5, and the bishop pair is very strong. So black can try a fancy move, knight to d3 check. We can now not take the knight because we are pinned by the queen. So we have to instead play king to d2. And here follows a quite funny line. Black will take our queen, and now we will take with the king. Because if we take with the bishop, black will take knight takes f2, hitting the rook, intending knight to e4 check, and black is better. We will take with the king, and this knight here most likely has to move. Okay, black can of course try to play a move like bishop to f5, but after different moves, one could be rook to d1, one other could be to play king e3. White is again better because of the bishop pair. So after king takes e2, knight f4 check, we'll play the king to f3, and white is better here because if black plays a move like knight to e6, we'll play pawn to h4, taking away the g5 square from the knight. And white is better here again because of the bishop pair. So this line with knight to g6, it's quite nice for white. Either you will get the bishop pair or you will be a pawn up at the endgame. So some black players have turned to play knight to f5. The idea is quite simple. You want to keep the d4 pawn defended. And here comes one of the reasons that I recommend this line with knight d2 to b3 is the move pawn to e4. It's quite nice because you're now hitting this knight on f5. And black has tried some different moves here. For example, bishop b4 check, we can just parry, bishop d2. If black plays a move like knight h4, we can take knight takes d4. And in many lines we're simply a pawn up here. If black takes a knight, we'll play either c5 is a good move. Can also play aggressively f4, hitting the knight. And after a move like knight to g4, we'll play c5. You can check out the analysis for this. It's a bit complicated, but white is actually winning. So some black players have tried this. They have taken this pawn on e3. And now what I really like about the line is we just take on d8. We trade the queens. If black takes with the king, f takes e3. At some point we can bring the king to f2. And even though this pawn might look weak on e5, it's not so easy for black to regain it. And white is simply much better here because of the pawn up, but also the knight on f5 is in trouble. And it's very similar case. After knight takes d8, we'll take f takes e3. And for example, if black gives a check now, bishop to b4 check, we'll play king f2, and the knight on f5 is not standing well. So this was it for my Albin's course. The idea is simply to play knight f3, and the only good way for black to play is knight to c6, and then we play knight bd2, a lot of times with the idea of playing knight b3, but also sometimes to play g3, bishop g2, or have ideas with a3 and b4. The most important line is bishop g4, we'll play pawn to g3, and after queen d7 we can play h3, pushing away this bishop from g4, and white is much better. And also please remember, after knight e7, knight to b3, if he goes to g6 we can take the pawn, or if he plays knight f5 we have this very strong move, pawn to e4, hitting the knight on f5, and white is much better. So thanks a lot for watching. I hope you can now learn to destroy the Albin. Bye bye.